The Airfix Spitfire Mk.Vb in 1/72 scale was once a key product in the Airfix range, but in the last 10 years or so this particular example has not been seen, with the only option really to find it on the second-hand market. In my youth I always wished I'd had the chance to build one of these, and now I finally can. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build this vintage Airfix Spitfire Mk.Vb in a back to basics style. For a deeper dive inside the box of this kit, take a look at the plastic parts, instructions and decals, check out the dedicated unboxing video I've already made on that topic, and in that particular video I compare it to the newer releases from Airfix to see what the differences are. In this video I'll be building this in a back to basics kind of style, which means building it in the same kind of techniques, using the same kinds of paints that I perhaps would have had access to in my youth. Finally, I'll be rounding this off with a review. As usual, I'm going to put a list of the products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy replicating this build for yourself. And without any further ado, let's get into it. As usual, I'm going to cut the parts away from the sprue using my cutters. This is a slightly older kit, so there is a small amount of flash in a few places, which could be carefully trimmed away with a knife or sanded down with a sanding stick. My cement of choice in this build will be Tamiya Extra Thin. And the first parts to be assembled were the very simple and crude cockpit details. There's not a great deal of cockpit detail inside this kit, but at the end of the build I don't think it really matters because you're not going to be able to see much of it. This was then glued into one half of the fuselage. Humbrol 78, which is a cockpit green colour, would then be hand painted onto the internal areas. Number 33, which is a matte black, would be used to pick out some select details, such as the reflector gun sight. With that done, I glued in the included pilot. I've already painted him off camera using my standard techniques which I've explored in other videos. The propeller assembly was next, with the propeller being glued into the spinner and then the retaining part at the back added. And it's at this point I can glue the two fuselage halves together. I do need to make sure to remember to add the propeller at this stage so that it can freely rotate. But I will have to be super careful with how I place my glue to prevent jamming this up. When the glue has dried, I'll spend a little bit of time cleaning up the seam where the two parts join together just to make it look a little neater. Now I can turn my attention to the lower side of the aircraft. In this component there is a slot designed into it which will accept a vintage display stand. Sadly, no display stand is included in the kit, but I do have some I purchased separately. I want my plane to be in a flying pose, so I carefully cut this slot out. With that done, the upper wing parts can be glued onto the lower wing. And then this assembly can be joined onto the bottom of the fuselage. Annoyingly, there is a bit of a gap at the wing roots. And whilst you can try and close it up by sort of bending the wings to give it more dihedral, I've thought this was a little bit too much. So in order to address this gap at the wing root, I'm going to use some Ammo MiG putty surfacer to try and fill it in. This was painted into the gaps and allowed to dry. A number of layers may be needed to build up this filler. Once it had dried, I would carefully sand those areas smooth. With that done, I moved on to adding the tail surfaces to the rear of the model, and then flipped it over to glue into place the various details on the underside of the aircraft. These include the various radiators. The cannon barrels need to be glued into their holes in the leading edges of the wings, and then the aerial master was glued into its slot on the top of the aircraft. The engine exhausts were glued in at this point as well, and then I glued in place the raised landing gear option. A lowered landing gear option is included if you'd like to use that instead. I masked the cockpit canopy off camera using my normal method, which is to apply tape and then carefully cut along the frame lines using a sharp knife. This was glued onto the aircraft using some Humbrol Clearfix. This glue should dry clear and strong, but it is a little bit stringy, so I have to be careful when I'm using it. And now it's time to prime. Humbrol No. 1 grey primer would be sprayed onto the entire model. I quite like using a primer before I hand paint because it gives a good surface for the paint to stick to. Priming is definitely something I would have done in my youth, but probably not as neatly. With that done, the first paint I'm going to use is some Humbrol No. 24 Trainer Yellow. This was painted onto the leading edges of the wings, as there is a kind of warning flash that needs to be present here. When that was dry, it would be masked with some masking tape. I am going a bit more old school with my paint choices for the main camouflage scheme, opting to use Humbrol enamels. They would all be thinned with a little thinner to help them flow a little better. Humbrol 90, which is a sky colour, was painted onto the spinner and also to replicate the fuselage band. The fuselage band will be masked when it's dry. This medium sea grey is next, and this will be painted onto the lower sides of the aircraft. I quite like using enamels because they give a reasonably smooth finish due to their long drying time. But the long drying time does mean you can't really make quick progress. But for someone like me who has other commitments such as a family and job, it does mean that I can do a little work, and then by the time I come back, the next layer is ready to be applied. On the upper surface, I would go for ocean grey. This would be carefully painted by hand to try and get a neat line separating the upper and lower surfaces. Whilst the enamels do have a reasonably good opacity, a couple of thin coats may be needed in a few places. With that done, Humbrol 30, which is a dark green, would then be carefully hand painted on to replicate the camouflage scheme. This was done by hand, trying to follow as best I could the black and white painting instructions. I don't find black and white painting instructions to be completely helpful, so I would use the box art as a reference and also do a little research myself to make sure I was trying to get it as accurate as possible. And when all that paint was dry, I would carefully remove the leading edge masks and the one on the fuselage band. The propeller blades were then painted in matte black, and so too would the tyres on the wheels. I would use a small amount of gloss red paint to indicate the fabric coverings over the barrels of the machine guns. And then the final thing was to apply some clear gloss to the entire model. This should help smooth out the surface in preparation for some decals. And speaking of the decals, you get a small sheet included in the box, and there are two paint schemes to choose from. I think I'm going to go for the United States Army Air Force version, as I have another Mk.Vb with the same paint scheme to do from Revell at some point in the future, and I don't really want a duplicate. I cut the decals from the sheet and then dipped them in warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you'd like to get your hands on your own brushwater mug so you don't mix it up with your cup of tea, check out the links in the description to my merch store. Humbrol Decal Fix will be used to help apply the decals, and this would be painted onto the aircraft in the relevant places, the decals carefully removed from the backing paper and slid into position, with a little more Decal Fix being applied over the top. It should help soften them into the surface details and allow them to really stick to the aircraft. The decals are to a reasonable quality despite their age. They are almost as old as I am. The printing is moderate, but there is a small amount of registration misalignment. This just means that things aren't quite as aligned as they probably should be. But on the whole, I found them fairly easy to use, and given that there are so few in this kit, this was a really quick and uncomplicated step. Of course, these are not up to the current standards of Airfix decals as they're manufactured by Cartograph, but the decals included in this boxing naturally predate Cartograph transfers. When all the decals had been applied and allowed to settle into the plastic, another coat of clear gloss would be painted over the top to help seal them in and protect them. With that done, I would mix together some 53 gunmetal grey and a little drop of red to create a burnt metal kind of paint. This would be carefully painted onto the engine exhausts. With that done, some Humbrol 49, which is an acrylic matte varnish, would be sprayed onto the entire plane to dull down that gloss coat and give everything a uniform finish. A small amount of weathering is going to be done using some of these aging powders from Humbrol. These are just fine pigments, a bit like pastel dust, and I decided to add some smoke staining to the engine exhaust areas and also the gun barrels. The dust is loaded onto a dry brush and then painted onto the aircraft, building it up closer to the exhaust area or the gun barrel and then streaking it down the aircraft in the direction of airflow. With that done, I would glue into place the clear landing light in the small hole on the bottom of the aircraft, and then carefully peel away my homemade masks from the cockpit canopy. The final step was to mount this aircraft on the vintage style display stand, and with that I'm going to call this build complete. And that's another build under the belt. So this was actually quite a pleasant build. It didn't have that many challenges and I really enjoyed getting back to basics. I just find something about hand painting a model really satisfying. It's no doubt that this particular kit is not up to modern standards, given that it features a variety of raised details. The internal cockpit area was very crude. The design is very simple, and there was a little bit of flash to deal with. Additionally, those decals are no doubt not up to modern standards as well, but despite their age I actually found them to be rather simple to use and they worked perfectly. There are some companies out there today which have worse quality decals in their modern productions, which I find very strange. The registration on these decals could have been a little better though, but I don't think it really detracts from the overall look of the aircraft. Some things I wasn't a massive fan of was that gap at the wing root, which had to be filled in with a little filler. Perhaps the filler I used in this build was not something I would have had access to in my youth, but I definitely had access to Humbrol filler, which would have worked in a similar way. Additionally, I have noticed a little bit of frosting from the matte varnish I applied at the end of the build, and I think this may have been down to the fact this was the very last amount of paint in the can. It literally ran out as I was using it, and I wonder if it's somehow pulled up a slightly different ratio of the paint mix as it was spraying it onto the aircraft and caused this frosting, as it's something I haven't really experienced before. On the whole, I kind of enjoyed building this one, so let's round it off with a little bit of a review. As mentioned, this is a kit you can no longer find in the Airfix range, having seen its last production run over a decade ago. The particular version I've got here dates from 1995, which I managed to find on the second-hand market a few years ago. It would be difficult to find a recommended retail price for this kit as it's out of production, but I would say that if you're spending more than £5 for this particular version, or a variant similar to this, you're probably spending too much. It is a very simple kit featuring only 35 parts, with the absolute most basics of detail, but generally it builds up quite nicely, and I didn't really have that many problems with it. Of course, the level of detail and the design style of this kit does lend itself to being an older tooling dating from 1975. This kit would have been a pillar of the Airfix range since the 1970s all the way up to the early 2010s, but it has kind of been superseded by a newer tool version of the Spitfire Mk.Vb. I do wonder if Airfix would ever consider re-releasing this kit, but if they did, they would have to do it as part of the Vintage Classics range. If they did decide to do that though, I'm sure it would still be quite popular. I do keep a note of everything that I do in my modelling journal, which is just a notebook which I keep on my desk and is specially formatted to help me keep a track of my builds. If you'd like to get your hands on your own copy to keep a log of your own builds as well, feel free to check out the links in the description. It helps support the channel. In here I wrote down that this build only took me a couple of days. And seeing as I worked it around other commitments and also those long drying times on those paints, this means that realistically this could be probably done in a day or so if you were really working fast. I particularly like that this comes with two paint schemes, and whilst they are very similar and there aren't that many decals to apply, actually sometimes I don't think that's a bad thing. I think though it's probably time to round this one up here. This kit is very much a product of its time, but despite this I had quite a lot of fun building this vintage kit in a back to basics style, and I'll be looking forward to my next build I can complete in a similar way. As always, let me know down in the comments what you thought of my build and whether my review of it was fair. Quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them and gain the perks that these guys get, check out the links in the description. I'd like to welcome our latest members to the club. They are Nico, Rice and Icarus. Thanks for joining us. Alternatively, there are other ways to help support the channel as well, and again, full information is below the video. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say from me is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.